you're a daunting audience for me because many of you know outcome mapping probably better than I do. And so it's a bit of a challenge to try to stand up here and speak to those of you who have so much experience using it. But what I'm going to try to do is I tried to find a balance of offering maybe some insights into using outcome mapping, particularly for evaluation, as well as recognizing that some of you have a lot of experience and for some of you this is new. So I hope I reached the right balance, but at a minimum, no, I tried. So outcome mapping led us, IDRC and its project partners developed outcome mapping because in the 1990s, we were really facing 5 big evaluation challenges. And I suspect many of these are going to resonate for all of you from what I've heard. One was, how do you measure what difference research makes? How do you establish cause and effect when we work in these complex open systems? When do you evaluate? If you go in early, people say, well, of course, not nothing, but impact hasn't happened yet. If you wait a long time, people say, I think I remember that research. It was, who did that? You know, you've waited too long, and so many other factors and actors have contributed. We also wanted to encourage learning. We didn't want just a methodology that proved, you know, this is what happened for forever and always. We wanted a way to think about how can we improve at what we're doing as we go. And finally, we took the stand of our belief that evaluation is not value neutral. And so we wanted to bring the values and the ideas of development research at IDRC into any evaluation work we developed. So that led us to the development of outcome mapping. And I just want to share this, what was done on a flip chart at a certain point in time about 8 years ago, because what it illustrates is the complexity of research to impact. And so if you think of the Research National Agriculture Research Organization doing good quality research at a certain point, and then you think of communities or beneficiaries, whatever language you want to use, being healthier, then having greater well-being, there's a lot that happens in between those things. And a group of researchers just started listing out all the things they could think of that contributed to that. And it was an extremely complex process that took a long period of time. So recognizing that as our starting point, outcome mapping was born from this sort of view about evaluation. And we decided to focus not on impact, but on outcomes. And those of you who are familiar with a sort of a results chain, sorry, the blue is very hard to see, but it says inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. Outcome mapping focuses on the outcome level. It defines outcome very particularly as changes in behaviors. Changes in behaviors in the broadest sense, though. Changes in relationships, changes in actions, changes in activities. Anything someone is doing in outcome mapping is defined as a behavior change. And I'm not saying, and outcome mapping isn't saying that the other dimensions aren't important or that you can't think of outcomes in other ways, but that's the niche, that's the focus of outcome mapping. I really wanted to share quickly with those, particularly those of you who are less familiar with outcome mapping, the key sort of 4 ideas that influence outcome mapping, whether you're using it for planning, whether you're using it for monitoring, or whether you're using it for evaluation. Thank you. The first one is really that outcome mapping is built on systems thinking. So the spider web is really trying to indicate that you're a part of this interconnected web of relationships. The second key point about outcome mapping is that it embraces change. That's the best way that I can put it. And change is seen as continuous. It's multidimensional, multidirectional. It's not something you try to control or you try to ignore. It's something that is a part of your context, and what outcome mapping tries to help programs do is manage that change as you go, to be adaptable and flexible because that's the context you're operating in. Outcome mapping, the third point, is really this idea of to bring about social change and innovation, which is what we're trying to do through our research work, you have to be attentive. You have to be learning as you go. So this idea of the owl, watching and learning and paying attention to what's happening, not only to what you want to accomplish, but how things are progressing as you go. So we're all owls, really. And then the fourth point about outcome mapping to remember is we took a stand at the beginning that we were not going to look for causal attribution of changes. We were going to be looking instead to understand contributions and influence rather than attribution. And this is becoming more and more acceptable in development evaluation. But a few years ago, it was one of the things that was most often raised when I presented outcome mapping that people really weren't comfortable with. But now everyone from the World Bank to other methodologies are promoting this. So it's quite nice to see that we're not alone. Outcome mapping's approach to evaluation, and this is the point that I really want to raise, is when we're talking about evaluation, that outcome mapping takes a very particular approach. And it's maybe not the traditional approach to evaluation. It'd be more what's defined in the evaluation field as developmental evaluation. So you've got a list on your left of what traditional evaluation sort of tends to promote and what developmental evaluation tends to promote. With really the idea, again, outcome mapping is for people, groups, teams, organizations, projects that are trying to contribute to social change and social innovation, and so you need an evaluation approach that helps you do that as well. So whether it's providing feedback for improvement, not being static in your measures, allowing them to be iterative, not always having expert-led evaluation, supporting self-assessment, looking at the system and the context in which change happens, managing multiple accountabilities, having an evaluator who considers not only the science, but also the context. There's not one right way to do evaluation, and then an emphasis on improvement. With outcome mapping, you can, with that being sort of the view of evaluation, you can evaluate 3 different things with outcome mapping. This is what it can help you evaluate. The first, the green, is really about the program, its relevance and its viability. The red is about the partners and outcomes, those changes in behaviors that I mentioned before. And then the purple is really where those two overlap, and that's about implementation. So the strategies or interventions of the program. So those are the 3 areas that outcome mapping can help you evaluate. We're going to talk mostly about outcomes because that was the commonality between GEM, most significant change, and outcome mapping, is it's about results. So I'm going to focus in on that with the little bit of time we have. But regardless of what you're evaluating, really outcome mapping wants you to think about any change within its own context. That change is never separate from its context. And if you want to learn about it, it's not enough to develop a generic list of best practices. Every change happens with a context, and we have to know it within that. So if you want to use outcome mapping for evaluation, what tools does it provide you to measure outcomes or to evaluate outcomes? The first point I want to raise on this is just to remember that when you're measuring outcomes, what you're measuring is the behavior change. And why is that the focus of outcome mapping? And it's really to bring people back in to the evaluation. One of the things that we've really noticed, and I think Jess and I were chatting about that this morning, is that for some strange reason, people came out of evaluation. And outcome mapping and methods that they're using as well are trying to bring a development evaluation back to the people. And the second point about behavior change is that it will illustrate that you don't control change, you influence change at best. And so it's an important reminder because I think a lot of the emphasis on causality, a lot of the emphasis on randomized controlled trials, a lot of the debates and evaluation now tend to imply that you can control things. But when you talk about behavior change, my experience is people very quickly will say, oh, but I can't predetermine how this person is going to change. You very quickly start talking about power dynamics and what are the limits of your influence. So outcome mapping, the two tools for measuring outcomes. The first one is whose behavior change are you measuring? In outcome mapping, it's a term, bit of a crazy term, called boundary partners, and it's a key concept of